Hey, it's James Mulvaney here. Welcome back to Create, Reach, Inspire. I've got an interesting question for you, which is, how do you go about building a successful podcast? As with most things in the digital space and digital world these days, I'd say most marketers will argue that paying attention to your analytics is a really good place to start, and also incredibly important to ensure that you're actually growing and progressing month on month. So this week, I'm joined by Dave Zohrob, who is founder of podcast analytics company Chartable, and he's going to be talking about, firstly, why podcasters need to grow their audience and why they need analytics as a core tool to actually do this. Secondly, mastering the marketing tools to help you understand listener habits, and also talking a lot about his platform Chartable and how it's making big changes in the world of podcast analytics. And finally, talking about podcasting in general and having a really kind of nerdy conversation about our predictions of podcasting, what's happening currently, what's coming next, which I really love to geek out on things like that. So if you're looking to build your podcast in the year 2020, make sure you stick around for this week's episode of Create, Reach, Inspire. All of that and more coming up now. So today my guest is Dave Zohrob from Chartable. Welcome along, Dave. How's it going?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Very good, yeah. And I wanted to get you on because obviously you've started Chartable, and you've come from working at AngelNest in the past. So really I wanted to find out more about you and your entrepreneurial journey. And so let's start off by finding out who Dave is.
Who is Dave? Well, I'm just an extremely complex character. I've been a computer programmer my whole life. Since I was a little kid, and for better or for worse, that's the only thing I've ever done. It's the only thing I've ever gotten paid for, actually. Even when I was like 8 years old, building stuff for people in my neighborhood or for my dad or something. I did the kind of standard computer science education and ended up working at Microsoft as my first job, and totally hated it. Not because, Microsoft's actually a great company. They're doing fantastic now.
Was that the default thing? You thought you needed to go and work for a big corporate then?
Well, it was a while ago. So I graduated from college 16 years ago, which is, there wasn't a ton. And I grew up in Michigan and suburban Detroit, and there was basically absolutely zero cultural knowledge of starting a startup or anything like that, right? So
it wasn't really on trend then,
No, it was not on trend, and in fact, my program, my computer science program in particular, is pretty traditional, and so I've been building internet stuff for since I was a little kid. I had been making programming tutorial website that you can actually still find if you Google me, programming tutorials I wrote when I was 13 years old or whatever.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's terrible. My good friend read some of that at my wedding as part of a speech, but it was a different time, and the folks I went to school with and my professors all thought that the internet was not serious science and not really worthy of deep exploration, and I should be focusing more on crazy algorithms and this kind of hard, quote unquote, hardcore computer science stuff. And I was this isn't really what I want to do. So Microsoft very kindly paid for me to get out of Michigan and over to Seattle. And I found that the corporate environment wasn't exactly it either. I wondered if I had made some kind of mistake. The thing I love was making stuff and having people use it, and the internet was a great way to do that. But I worked on Outlook, which was it's a very popular email program. Hundreds of millions of people use it, but my contributions over the course of the year plus that I worked there are extremely tiny. And
I think that's pretty cool though. So you worked on Outlook.
Yeah, Outlook and Word.
Everyone remembers Outlook,
Yeah.
And I Word, think maybe remembers is the key word there.
Yeah, that's fair. I feel like people still use. I have to use Word just because I deal with lawyers, so lawyers use Word, therefore I use Word. So there is some small chunk of my contribution lives on there, I imagine. But yeah, I ended up moving to San Francisco just to play music and be with friends, and I started a record label, and it's just kind of not doing a lot of computer stuff, and kind of accidentally fell into the startup scene there, because that's where Startup Central was at the time. I didn't know it, wasn't planning on it, and that's what I ended up doing. I ended up working at a startup called Hot or Not, which is an early dating site, and that was my startup school. It was a very small company. very profitable, there's a few people there, and I thought it would be kind of a joke. It's like a picture rating site. You rate people's pictures from 1 to 10 on how hot they are. Not exactly something that I would be terribly proud of in retrospect, but it turns out everyone there.
Do you know? I just remember. I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the brand is still around or something, but
yeah.
It was cool. I mean, like,
what was that, like 2004, round about then?
Yeah, I joined in 2005. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was very popular, and it was a time when, like, even in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, that like startups were still not cool. Like there was the big bust. And so,
it's interesting you said it was actually very profitable and it was a small team, and like those two words never go hand in hand nowadays.
It was unusual. Yeah, I mean, it was like only a few people and they were making tons of money a year. So like I was like, wow, I got to do this. And it was also like super different than it was like the opposite of the corporate environment. Like there were a few of us, we all did all kinds of stuff. Design, development, database stuff, customer support, thinking about new features and product stuff. It was just, and I was like, yeah, this is it. This is what I thought I would be doing, And so, started the company with one of the founders of that company. We did a bunch of mobile social networking and dating apps in the early days of the App Store. And then I ended up at AngelList, in 2011. AngelList, for those that don't know, was originally a network for startups to meet investors, and I built out their recruiting platform. So it was a way for people to find jobs at startups and for startups to hire people, and that's what I worked on for more or less 5 years on and off at AngelList. I took a quick break to try a different startup, which totally failed, and then went back. And
really? What was that, out of interest?
It was called Lookmark, like bookmark with an L. It was a social media plugin for Chrome about like automatically sharing what you read, like news, with a private group. Totally not worked now. I think everybody's like so privacy centric. We just thought it was cool, and we had like a big group of early adopters. But we just couldn't really quite make the jump from that early adopter group to like a broader group, and couldn't quite see the business case there. So after a little over a year, we just said, hey, this isn't working. Rather than like burn through all our investors' money, we're just going to give it back. And so gave it back.
Fail fast then.
Yeah. I mean, like in retrospect, maybe we could have spent some more time on it. But I feel like it wasn't quite working, and really like social media, it's just so hard to, make a business model there. I think Snapchat started around the same time, so certainly it was possible. But I don't know that we were the guys to do it. And so I ended up back at AngelList and working on that recruiting platform, which turned from a side project into, what's now like a 60+ person team in New York and San Francisco, with folks all over the world, placing, tens of thousands of jobs a year, which was an awesome journey to see that.
Yeah, and a big contribution. I guess that's part of the core platform now, really.
Yeah, it's turned into a great business, and it's something. It has much more kind of like a broader appeal than investor-focused stuff. Like you have to be, especially in the U.S., there are all kinds of regulations about who can invest in startups, and so by definition, unless you're like a reasonably wealthy person, you can't participate in that side of AngelList. But everybody needs a job. So, that ended up growing to be like the primary way that people associate with AngelList. So that was pretty cool.
So, and throughout this whole time, have you always been a podcast listener?
Yeah, always been a listener. I remember, when Odeo, the precursor to Twitter, started, they actually shared server space with us at Hot or Not. Like we used back in the day, pre-cloud, right, when people owned servers and rented racks and all that stuff. And the Odeo guys were borrowing server space from us. And I was like, what is this podcast thing? This is so crazy. Obviously, Twitter turned out to be something entirely different. But that was like the first time that I started paying attention.
Sure.
And then I ended up leaving AngelList a couple of years ago now, with the idea that, hey, I'm getting older, haven't stretched startup gold, but I still want to do it, and I still want to give it another try. It's never going to get any easier to start something. I'd already had one kid at that point and knew that we wanted to have more children, and I was like, it's never gonna get easier, so we might as well do it now. So I left towards the end of 2017, and a good friend of mine that I worked with there also left, and so we decided to start working together. We didn't have any particular idea in mind. We both were podcast listeners, and we eventually decided to start a podcast together, just as an experiment to see what would happen, just because we were interested. And so the podcast was to summarize this startup news board that we've both been participants in, called Hacker News, which is based out of the Y Combinator Accelerator in San Francisco, or in Mountain View. And we're like, what if we just like summarize that every day, and would people want to listen to it? And it turns out the answer was yes. So we put together a landing page, threw it up there. People loved, we got hundreds of email signups within an hour, and we thought, okay, maybe there's something here. And so we decided to start doing a daily tech news podcast. And honestly, we were blown away by the response. We had thousands of listeners on the first day, and it grew to be like 4,000 or 5,000 downloads a day by the time we decided that doing a daily tech news podcast was a totally insane endeavor for a couple of programmers. And so we hit pause on that. But it just really opened our eyes to like the opportunities in audio and in podcasting.
The scope of the market as well.
Yeah.
And especially when you hit upon a topic that's like popular, there's already an audience there.
Yeah. And it's just crazy that like people were choosing to listen to us. Like, I'm a programmer, right? Like my hot skills are behind the keyboard, not behind the mic, right? So, maybe with the exception of the bands I played in like 15 years ago, so like it just felt strange that we were getting thousands of people to decide to make us part of their day, and that just really spoke to, it just really signaled to me like, hey, these people must really need better audio if they're willing to listen to me. And so we also ran into a bunch of problems, like trying to figure out why our audience was growing and where these people are coming from, all the kind of basic measurement, growth, marketing stuff that a lot of podcasters run into once you start getting into it. And for us, coming from startup world and the digital world, we just thought, wow, it's so weird that you have so little information on where your listeners are coming from or what's going on, And so we decided to explore, seeing if there are ways that we can contribute as like data nerds and programmers and whatever. If there's like, is there anything we could do here to help solve that problem?
Yeah, so that's how the idea for Chartable came about. So what is it that most appeals to you about the medium itself as part of running the podcast that you did and having the success? Why do you think that was? What is it that's unique about the medium?
Well, I think that there's a lot of amazing stuff about the medium. I'm not going to go into like the kind of standard like, oh, humans are storytellers and we're just like designed to hear stories and all that stuff. Ultimately, I think for us, like our podcast was pretty low rent, pretty low budget, and filled a practical need, which is that there are plenty of times in the day where you might want to hear about something, but you're not sitting in front of your computer. And in fact, it's a feature that you can get a lot of that stuff. You can get a lot of the news without being in front of your computer. To be a part of your commute, to be part of your morning routine at home, and that screenless nature of the medium, I think, is fantastic, right?
Especially for when you're dealing with a tech crowd who are
for sure. Yeah, so like basically
other things on their screen. Yeah,
like one potential way to read it, just for our podcast in particular, is that like tech nerds and startup nerds like can't get enough startup stuff, and so we just put it in their ears, like in addition to their eyes, so like maybe there's not like a deep lesson to be learned there, but it certainly pointed to just the fact that like people really, really want audio. They really, really want to be able to have, whether it's like a learning thing like information or news, or if it's about entertainment, to have the opportunity to fit that into their day in different ways rather than sitting in front of a screen.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of stats, because obviously Chartable, the core purpose of Chartable is about data, it's about analytics.
Yeah.
How come you decided to go down that route rather than maybe like looking at production or hosting or the wider scope of what constitutes a podcast? What was it specifically that appealed to you about the stats side of things?
Well, yeah, we're nerds, like stats nerds. So like a lot of the stuff I did at AngelList and at my other jobs was to do analytics and stats and try to figure out what was growing stuff. But even before that, we spent a couple of months, I think, talking to creators of all sizes, like from super small indies to pro podcasters to networks, talked to some advertisers, talked to podcast listeners, and tried to get as far out of my like tech circle as possible when talking to listeners, and just saying like, what is it? Trying to figure out, what motivates them, what motivates each person, whether it's a creator, an advertiser, or a listener. Like what are their problems? What are their things they love? And I came from the app world. My first startup was building apps, and I thought, oh man, I'm going to make a podcast app. It's going to be so awesome. After talking to listeners, they're like, I don't really want to change apps. Like even the people that are on kind of a standard Apple Podcasts app, I think a lot of hardcore podcast listeners would hate on that app. But most people are pretty satisfied with it. Or even if they're not terribly satisfied, the chances of them switching are pretty low. So
it does the job, and it's there already, basically.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, people come to the app for the audio, not for the app, right? So as long as the app doesn't get too much in the way of the stories you want to hear or the news you want to hear, then it's fine, right? And so we thought, okay, so we're not going to do an app. We looked at all the creator tools out there. There's amazing platforms out there. Felt very competitive. And we thought, okay, I don't really know that I have, something new to offer there. And this was at the time when like Anchor was like super taking off, at least in the US, like, they're giving their stuff away for free. And we saw a lot of, we saw so many podcasts being powered by Anchor. And we were okay, we're not going to do that. So like, what's left? What can we do? And the idea of, one of the problems we faced when we were creating our podcast was that for example, like Pocket Casts, which is a pretty popular app on iOS and Android, maybe has, like, according to Libsyn, 1 or 2% of the overall listening market. Pocket Casts, for whatever reason, ended up growing to be like a third of our listenership, right? Which is super out of whack with its global, percentages, right? And so we were like, oh, that's weird. Like, why are so many Pocket Cast listeners listening to Hacker Daily, our podcast? And I was like, all right, Pocket Cast was $5. I'm just trying to download it and see what's going on, right? Like maybe there's something going on there. And so I downloaded the app, paid for it, opened it up, and they had a trending chart inside the app. And we were on the trending chart at like number 10 or something. And it was throwing like hundreds of new listeners to us a day. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, why didn't I know that, right? If I had known that, is there anything I could have done to like push that harder, or like email the podcast people and get like an editorial feature, or like, if I had that info, I felt like I maybe could have acted on it, And so there's a pattern, a similar thing happened with the App Store when it first came out back in 2008, like a year after the iPhone launched. You could first start building apps and releasing apps, and you got very little information about the people who are downloading your app. Apple would release numbers, if I remember correctly, like once a day. And I remember like refreshing the iTunes like Connect thing, like how many downloads did we get? And
didn't they have like a CSV that you could get? And
yeah, you could get the CSV, but it was like once a day, like 9 a.m. Pacific or noon Pacific, something like that. And like I remember like just refreshing as soon as that, trying to wait for that file to come out, right? And podcasting is like certainly a little bit better than that. You can get download numbers updated in more or less real time from most hosts, right? But you don't really know much about those people or how they found you or anything. And so we thought maybe there's a lot of companies that emerged in the app world, like App Annie and Sensor Tower and App Figures, that help developers solve some of these data problems, give them analytics on their chart positions and reviews, and developers could hook up ad networks and other stuff. And it was a huge win for developers and a great win for App Annie. They ended up, building a great business on some of that data. And so we thought, okay, we're going to do the same thing for podcasts. We're going to put everybody's data all in one place. We can get your charts and reviews, and then you can kind of have a mission control for your podcast. And that was the kind of original vision for Chartable. And we kind of ran it by the folks that we had been chatting with over the last, the prior couple of months, and they said, yeah, that sounds cool. And so we just said, all right, let's just try to do it.
Hey, so if you're enjoying this week's episode of Create, Reach, Inspire, and you want to get behind the scenes and see lots of bonus content, then please follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram. You can search James Mulvaney, or on Instagram it's at Create, Reach, Inspire, all one word. And there's lots of information on there and exciting tips and tricks that I'm learning along the way of running various different businesses, plus also behind the scenes content of this podcast as well. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. So just summarize for anyone who's listening, perhaps doesn't understand how it works. What does Chartable do? What's the core function of the product, and how does it get all this data and kind of combine it?
Yeah, sure. So it's actually changed quite a bit since the original. Like the original vision was all your data in one place, and we were pulling data from Apple and Spotify and a couple other places. We could pull public data like your chart positions and rankings and your reviews, because like most people can only see. It's only easy to see the reviews from the country that you're actually in, from Apple Podcasts, but we grab them from all around the world. And we could also collect private data by helping you grab your Apple and Spotify consumption data from those portals and putting it all in one place. We could also this is something we launched a few months later, which is to do an analytics prefix, sit in your RSS feed, and give you a third-party, hopefully independent, valid analysis of your traffic. So a lot of people are on hosting platforms like SoundCloud, no offense to SoundCloud, which isn't that great, and don't give amazing stats, and we were able to help those folks get their stats in one place and get a better handle on what's going on with their show. It's evolved a lot since then. I mean, that functionality of being kind of mission control for your podcast, that's definitely still there, and it's a big part of what we do. But we've since built a couple of extra products on top of that to solve more specific problems.
So how are you making moves in the space now? What are those products, and what solutions are they trying to provide? Yeah,
so we're ultimately a podcast measurement company. So we help both publishers and advertisers understand what's going on with podcasting. For publishers, that does include that mission control for your podcast, getting all the data in one place. We've also built some very specific tools to help with podcast marketing. So one of the tools is called Smart Links. It basically helps you, like if you can post a link to anywhere and see how many downloads came in through that link. For whatever reason, nobody had ever done that before. And if you're trying to grow your show, whether that's through organic social media, your newsletter, or through paid advertising like Google, Facebook, whatever, in order to really do a good job, you have to know how many new listeners you're getting. And so we built this tool, like building on all the infrastructure we had built with kind of that first mission control type version of Chartable. And it really resonated with creators, especially the larger networks who are doing, more focused promotion of their shows. But even for folks who are, smaller podcasters, it's helpful to have one link that you can share, help your listeners find the right app to listen in, and then you can actually track how many downloads come in through that link. So you can see whether it's your Facebook posts or your Twitter posts or whatever it is that's actually driving listeners to your show.
That sounds really useful. And what would you say the main challenges you have at the moment are? How have you kind of dealt with? Obviously, I know Apple said that they weren't keen on people scraping stats, and they haven't released a public API as such, which I think's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, we try to communicate with Apple about what we're doing. They're aware of what we're doing. There's plenty of folks in the app world who are doing similar things, and so ultimately, you don't have to connect your Apple account to Chartable if you don't want to. I feel like plenty of people can make that decision for themselves. But we see ourselves as providing a service to the podcaster and helping to grow the community. Like having that data accessible and in a way that is comparable to, for example, the Spotify data, I think helps people make better editorial and content decisions about which of their episodes are actually resonating.
What do you think about the podcasting space as a whole at the moment then? Because obviously Spotify have made a huge effort to try and, make a big kind of mark on the overall, the app being the most popular. And it's changed a hell of a lot over the past year even. What sort of trends are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting space right now. I think, Apple has had a position of dominance for a long time, but if you look worldwide, iPhone is the dominant platform in the US, but not in a lot of other countries. But it's kind of strange overall that iPhone is the dominant consumption medium for podcasts, and I would expect that to change over time. Spotify is certainly making big moves. Makes a ton of sense for them. They have tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of people using their app. It's pretty easy for them to point them to podcasts. They don't have to pay royalty fees on podcasts. I imagine that's pretty attractive. But it also increases engagement with their app overall. I think in the last earnings call, they mentioned that people who start listening to podcasts on Spotify also are more likely to become paid Spotify subscribers, even though being a paid Spotify subscriber doesn't actually remove ads from podcasts. So there's obviously some super beneficial things there when they're increasing engagement with their app. I think
Yeah.
Pandora is also investing pretty heavily. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more from Doodle and perhaps Amazon and Netflix as well. I think for podcasters, like it presents an interesting opportunity to get more listeners across more platforms. That said, it's also pretty clear that if you look at the history of what's happened in different platforms, different media, that or if you've read Ben Thompson's blog Stratechery about aggregation theory, the folks who control consumer demand have an outsized power in the market. That's why Google and Facebook have dominated advertising online. I would not be surprised if Spotify or others, like whether or not they're explicitly saying they're going to do that, are like trying to leverage their position as aggregators of consumer demand to change the way that podcasts are created or monetized. And so there's certainly opportunities to get paid, but also potential opportunities to be, to have like media company leverage placed against you as an independent creator.
Having that control like YouTube do, which kind of, I think that's a one unique thing that podcasting still has, is that, there's no rights or wrongs. It's not controlled by anyone. And, it's a kind of fairly sort of level, fair platform for everyone.
I think that's one of the amazing things about the entire space, right? Yeah.
And it's funny because it stood the test of time in the sense that it started like that and it's still like that today. However, I think, it's scary to think that, one company could effectively move in and slowly but surely then get to a stage. But then I guess YouTube started like that as well. When YouTube first launched, there was probably like a dozen other video sharing sites, video platforms that were people using. But, within the space of a very short amount of time, 3 years maybe, they kind of became the number one. And slowly but surely these other sites, a few of them still exist, but a lot of them shut down.
I think it's going to be an interesting few years to see what happens here. I don't think anything's going to happen like tomorrow or even next year. I think it's still going to be a transitional time. I think creators have to figure out how they want to approach these platforms. There's certainly benefits to playing. Obviously, having your podcast on Spotify means you'll get more distribution. The thing that's going to change is when the monetization stuff changes. Right now, podcasters get to control what goes in their show and can monetize however they see fit, whether that's with advertisements or with subscriptions. We think that's great. I'm like a huge fan of that. Like it's so rare. I mean, part of what attracted me to building a business in this medium in the first place is that it's so unusual that to have a medium with such a large audience that has so few gatekeepers, like you had mentioned before. And
it's absolutely. I think it's special in this day and age.
Yep, it's special, unusual, and of course, everyone's going to try and take it for themselves. If I was a huge company with bazillions in revenue and whatever, I would, the capitalism dictates that in order to maximize my shareholder value, I have to go take this beautiful thing and make it my own. That's like half in jest, but also like it's clearly like a huge prize if Spotify or Pandora can figure out how to crack even 10% or 20% and be a consistent 20% of all consumption of podcasts. It's going to be a massive business win for them. For us, like we're super committed to the open ecosystem. I'm glad that Spotify is increasing and Pandora and everyone are increasing their exposure of podcasts to folks who may not have listened already. I think that's great for listeners as a whole. And for creators, like having bigger audiences is going to be great for everyone.
And what would you say, having kind of the sort of a huge chunk of data that you can kind of analyze, what would you say the trends have been over the past year in terms of consumption and audience data? How do you think podcast listeners are changing? Have you seen any significant shift over the last couple of years since you sort of launched Chartable?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a shift towards, Apple is losing its dominance. I mean, it's still, I think, I would guess over 50%. I haven't run the numbers like super recently. But Spotify is bringing in all kinds of people, and that's partly because like the story on Android is so poor. Prior to Spotify's entry, like you had to buy an app or use one of the apps like Podcast Addict or something. And there's a surprising number of people who use Podcast Addict. It's been around forever. It still drives a fair amount of downloads. But it's not like it's like a power user type experience. It's not like something that I would imagine a non-tech user being super comfortable with. And so Spotify is bringing a lot more of those non-listeners and turning them into podcast listeners, which is amazing.
But I think that sort of sums up how podcasting has changed. 10 years ago, podcasting was really something for the enthusiasts, and it was for, people who were listening to podcasts on things which perhaps were very technical or, business driven or whatever it might have been. And nowadays, the kind of wider spread population is listening to podcasts as an alternative way of listening instead of radio or whatever.
Yep.
And as a result, that kind of mainstream adoption has driven, like you say, the move away from having to, in terms of, we've seen this as well, people who are looking to publish podcasts, they don't want to have to understand the ecosystem and how it works and the concept of having an RSS feed and everything, which is really it's quite technical for someone to kind of get their head around if they've not got any experience with that sort of thing.
We spent the first year of our company focusing on building tools for creators and publishers of all sizes. And one of the things that we started hearing in the summertime, we started hearing from a lot of advertisers. So the summer of this year, a lot of advertisers started reaching out to us and saying like, hey, you have all this data on podcasts. Can you help us figure out, how to buy ads or like what to do, And so...
and is that a thing about what kind of adverts resonate well with what sort of listener, or is it more a case of what topics of a podcast should I choose for? How does it work?
Kind of everything, yeah. So when we were originally approaching, if you actually talk to advertisers who buy a lot of podcast ads, like it's a pretty painful process. One of the again, going back to the beauty of the medium, it's super decentralized. There's no gatekeepers. If you're trying to buy a bunch of ads, you have to go talk to a bunch of people and try to, whether you're trying to talk to very small shows about, for example, podcasting or internet marketing or email marketing or whatever, you have to go find those podcasts, find their email addresses, reach out, see if you can schedule, negotiate. So that's its own thing. And then, again, going back to the data question of like what you know about listeners, it's super hard to know whether the ads actually worked, right? So, if I buy a bunch of ads, I might say, okay, go to chartable.com/ the daily and enter the code the daily, and then I'll figure out how many people actually signed up for Chartable based on the ad. But that's like a super rough measurement. It's basically like a radio advertisement, not like a digital advertisement. And so we've ended up building a suite of tools to help advertisers understand which ads are actually working across whether they're buying one ad or buying a huge campaign across like 10 different shows. We work with both advertisers and publishers to use like our measurement that comes from our RSS prefix to help better understand which ads are actually working. So advertisers can double down on the shows that are working. And our thesis here is that publishers of great content are going to get rewarded more over time because like their shows are listened to more, and that the listeners will take action more based on what the hosts say. So
sure, okay. And so to finish up, these are the three questions we ask, or two questions we ask everyone. Firstly, what are your top three traits of any good entrepreneur?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think this might be cliche, but I think it just comes down to not giving up. I think that so I guess that's grit if you're looking for a trait. I've been in startups for like a long time now, and I think when I was younger in my 20s, I like was expecting, for whatever egotistical or crazy reason, that I would achieve success magically, quickly, and be rich like all the people you read about and whatever online, starting great startups and getting huge right away. And most stories are not like that, and the stories are people worked super hard for years and then they're an overnight success, right? And so once people figure out what they're doing, and so we're committed to doing this company for a long time. I think I've learned that lesson the hard way, and so grit is something that I really care about. I think the other thing would be balance, and that's again maybe I'm just like doubling down on being old here, but like I used to try to make up for. Startups are an incredible amount of work, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
You could work 24/7 and still never be done. Well, there's always more work to do. But at some point, I used to make up for the fact that I was bad at prioritizing by just like working more hours, and I can't do that anymore. I've got kids, I've got a family, I want to see them, and so you just have to be like way more ruthless with your prioritization so you can achieve some kind of balance in your life between your work, your family, and your like personal health, which is also something I used to neglect. So that's two, grit and balance. The third one, I don't know if I have a quick answer. I'm just going to stick with two. Is that okay? That's contrarian.
That's fine. Yeah, of course it's fine. Those are the two things that are most important to you in terms of, how the rules that you run your business by, basically.
Yes.
What is, would you say, the best piece of business advice that you've ever received?
What is the best piece of business advice I've ever received? This is going to be, I think, specific to startups. But I used to work at AngelList. The founder is this guy, Naval Ravikant, super great guy, visionary investor, founder type guy. And he, whenever I've tried starting startups a bunch of times now. He would always say that like starting like a hugely ambitious startup and going for something that's like crazy big idea is just as hard as building like something that you think is going to be really easy and like a small business or a lifestyle business or whatever, right? That like no matter what, like doing anything is just incredibly hard, right? Like building something from scratch, getting people to care about it, building a business, unless you're lucky, it's just brutally difficult. And so I think just thinking about what you actually want to spend your time on and being ambitious about that has been an important lesson for me. Like when we started
having something where you're actually passionate about.
Yeah, that, but also the idea that like I think a lot of folks, I think people underestimate how much work starting any venture is going to be, right? And whether that venture is something really simple like, oh, I'm just going to write an ebook and try to sell that, or the venture is like, oh, I'm going to make a venture-backed startup for podcast measurement like I'm doing. They're all like a crazy amount of work. And so figuring out, trying to choose very carefully what you work on and being ambitious about that and taking the time to do that was a big lesson for me.
Okay, and finally, just to finish up then, I watched a video you did a while ago when you were giving a talk, and you were talking about how empathy is the key to business growth. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing, because that's not normally a word you hear on stage when someone's talking about growing a business.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to get your perspective on that, and maybe you could just sort of just say why you kind of have that opinion.
Yeah. So I think like if you look at Y Combinator, that incubator I was speaking about earlier, like their main thing is like make something people want. That's like what you're supposed to come out of this like 3-month crazy. To be clear, I've never done this. My co-founder did this like 10 years ago or whatever. But like, how do you make something people want if you don't have any empathy for what their problems are, right? For me, especially coming into the podcast market, long-time listener, but I've never built tools for creators or for advertisers. How do you actually do that if you don't put yourself in your customer's shoes and like really try to ask what their problems are, what's their day-to-day like how are you going to, like when they get to work or whatever it is, like whether it's their passion project or whatever, and they're like, how is Chartable going to like help these people out, right? And like what is their experience of Chartable going to be? And we have like so much work to actually achieve the vision that we have, but I don't think we'd be here at all if we didn't do a ton of research and customer interviews and just try to figure out like how do we slot in to the problems that people are facing. So it's funny that you mentioned that talk is 5 years old. Nice research, but we think it's a big part of what we do here. We talk about building with empathy all the time. As programmers, like we're super technical people in a way that our users are not. And
do you ever find that sort of it can be a hindrance in terms of it's very easy to get sucked up in the world of code and writing, creating a product, and then you actually forget, and you're so fixated on, well, how are we going to solve this and make it more efficient or whatever, and then you actually forget that actually what you're doing needs to translate for something for the user.
For sure.
I think that's really kind of, especially considering you describe yourself as a technical founder. I think having that kind of perception is quite useful actually.
Yeah, I mean, I've been building stuff on the internet for 25 years at this point. No joke. Totally weird, right?
Yeah.
And I am still humbled all the time by the fact that I can't make something easy to use the first time I try. It's always harder than I think it's going to be 25 years in, right? And you always find that my mental model of how things should work is not the same as like what the customers is, right? And especially in this medium, a lot of people get into this medium, they're audio people or they're storytellers or journalists or creatives. They're not programmers. They're not like techies in my techie sense, and so we really have to bridge that gap. Like you had mentioned, earlier, it's like nobody wants to know about RSS feeds, right? They want to like do their thing, right? They want to make their show, right? And so it's been an especially interesting challenge and opportunity here to like build for this audience, and it's been a lot of fun.
Cool. All right, Dave, thanks very much for your time today. If someone wants to find out more about Chartable or find out more about you, how can they do so?
So you can go to chartable.com and check us out. If you're a publisher, we'd be happy to help you grow your show. If you're an advertiser, we're happy to help you figure out which ads are actually working. And if you want to learn about me, I don't know why you do, but you can listen to Chartable Radio, which is our podcast. Season 2 is coming up soon. And you can go to zohrob.com, ZOHROB.com.
Dave Zohrob, thanks very much. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you, James. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please remember to hit that like button and write us a review. Or if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn @James Mulvaney. Thanks for watching. Take care and have a great day.